Okay, so today we're going to talk about the adrenal gland. And the adrenal glands are also called the suprarenal glands. Supra means above, and the kidney, we see here, the adrenal glands sit above or on top of the kidneys. And so when you look at the adrenal gland, they're almost like two glands in one. Well, they really are. There's the adrenal medulla, which is this maroon portion on the inside. Then there's the adrenal cortex, which is the portion, it's the superficial portion there, okay? And so they're each going to produce different hormones. We're going to cover that. I will probably cover the adrenal medulla in a separate video. So the adrenal cortex has 3 zones, and each of those zones is going to produce a different classification of hormone. Now, we mentioned in previous chapter or in previous videos that the anterior pituitary produces a hormone called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, that goes through the adrenal cortex and causes the adrenal cortex to produce corticosteroids. Well, the 3 zones are going to produce different classifications of those corticosteroids. Okay? The first zone is called the zona glomerulosa. That is going to produce something called mineralocorticoids. And the primary mineralocorticoid that we're going to talk about is aldosterone. So what does aldosterone do? I will be covering this in more detail in both blood pressure section of the heart chapter as well as in the kidney, but let's give you some basics here. Aldosterone increases the reabsorption of sodium. Okay? Now, reabsorption always means this. It means going from the kidney tubules back into the blood. Right? So when we absorb something, it goes into the blood. When we reabsorb it, it goes back into the blood, and that happens in the kidneys. So what aldosterone is going to do is going to increase that reabsorption of sodium. Okay? And something that we're going to learn is that water likes to follow sodium. Okay? Because it changes this osmotic gradient. And so water likes to go where sodium goes. And so a primary function of aldosterone is reabsorption of sodium. What we have to understand also is every time we pull a sodium back into the blood, we will excrete a potassium. They're both positive ions and they move in opposite directions. They do the same thing as we will see in 201, you see in the muscle chapter. And so sodium is going to move one direction, potassium the other. So when you secrete aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, you're going to reabsorb more sodium and you're going to excrete more potassium. And that's all I'm going to say about aldosterone at this point. Now, the next zone, right, is the zona fasciculata. That is going to produce the glucocorticoids, the primary one being cortisol. So we'll talk just a little bit about cortisol. Cortisol gets a bad rap. It gets a bad rap as the bad hormone. Now, cortisol is a catabolic hormone, which means it breaks things down. And so rather than building up like an anabolic hormone. So, however, in smaller amounts, it's good. It increases something called gluconeogenesis. So glucose, new, genesis, formation. So what is that? What's gluconeogenesis? It's the formation of glucose from a non-carbohydrate source. Well, we may need this because glucose is our primary source of fuel for generating ATP, which is our cellular form of energy. Now, it does other things, right? It increases blood sugar. That's like glucose. It increases amino acids in the blood. It increases fatty acids in the blood. Again, in smaller amounts, it's very necessary. In fact, cortisol is an anti-inflammatory hormone, decreasing inflammation. Now, what if we produce too much of it, which is the case for many individuals if they're stressed or anxious or under any kind of physical, mental, emotional type stresses, our body will produce excessive cortisol. And this is problematic because inflammation is the first stage of repair for tissues. And so if you are over-inhibiting inflammation, now you're inhibiting the repair of tissues. It can mess with the GI tract. It can actually impair memory in excessive amounts. So when people get very anxious, they tend to forget and have problems with recall. It's not just psychological, it's also physiological because cortisol will impair some of that process. What else will cortisol do? It'll impair and hamper the immune system. Again, it's a catabolic hormone, so it stimulates the breakdown of tissues. And so again, small amounts, this is necessary for the healing processes and restoration processes, but in excessive amounts, it can be very, very problematic. Now, we have a couple of disorders as far as cortisol production as well. Now, cortisol, if we produce it, now disease process-wise, if it's hyposecreted, okay, it's a result of something called Addison's disease. Now, Addison's disease actually hyposecretes aldosterone, which we just mentioned, as well as cortisol. So both of those are low. Remember, the word hypo means low. Cushing's syndrome is the disease process where we have hyperadrenalism, and that's an excessive production of cortisol. Now, all the same things I mentioned from that stress, that overreactive chronic stress response, it's going to happen in Addison's. It's going to happen a lot faster because you're hypersecreting cortisol at a disease state type rate, okay? So again, all of those things I talked about, diminishing tissue repair, impairing the immune system, GI tract. In fact, another really important thing about excessive cortisol, it causes failure of pancreatic beta cells. What the heck is that? Well, beta cells are the ones that produce insulin. So if you cause those cells to fail, you end up with type 2 diabetes, okay? Now, type 1 diabetes is known as the insulin dependent. However, if you cause the cells to fail to produce insulin, over time, type 2 diabetes may also need insulin because they're not producing it. So that's something really, really important. I think that's a super important clinical fact. Now, cortisol, the way to remember this, and I'll kind of close with this, is hypo is low, hyper is high, low comes before high, and Addison's starts with A, Cushing starts with C, A comes before C. So the hypo goes with the A, the Addison's, and the hyper goes with the C, the Cushing's. That's just a quick little memory cue to hopefully help you remember it. If you have any questions on this, let me know. Oh, one more thing I got to cover. I don't get into depth on this, but the last zone is the zona reticularis, and that is going to produce gonatocorticoids, and those are male hormones or androgens, but they are produced in both males and females. And so we'll cover more of that stuff when we talk about male and female hormones, and most of that I kind of lean towards when we get to the reproductive chapter. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. Stay strong. I'll see you next time.